The year was 1944, deep in the Pacific, a night thick with diesel smoke and the sour smell of sweat-soaked uniforms. Floodlights hummed over the wire fences of an American prisoner camp. Inside, rows of tar paper huts shimmered under the heat. A radio somewhere coughed static, then silence, and in that silence one voice sliced through the air, sharp, deliberate, and cruel. "That one is mine tonight." Every head turned. The voice belonged to a U.S. officer, half drunk, boots muddy from inspection rounds. His finger pointed toward a cluster of Japanese prisoners, and stopped on a young woman, her hands clasped, eyes hollow but unbroken. She was a former military nurse, captured months earlier on Leyte. Around her, the camp fell into a strange stillness. Even the guards shifted uneasily, pretending not to have heard. Reports suggest that fewer than 1% of the 400,000 Axis prisoners held by U.S. forces were women. In such camps, the lines between power and survival blurred dangerously fast. The officer's smirk widened, as if possession was victory. A single cigarette ember dropped to the dirt. The woman didn't move. She just looked at him, slow, steady, defiant. One guard muttered under his breath, "Sir, the rules," but the officer cut him off. Rules meant little here. The jungle swallowed screams, and paperwork didn't travel faster than shame. Yet something about her gaze, the quiet calculation behind it, froze even him. Later, one prisoner wrote, "Even the stars hid that night." The moon slipped behind clouds, the air pressing heavy with a storm that never came. A generator sputtered, lights flickered, and the uneasy hum of the camp fell away to nothing but breath and heartbeat. Inside that fragile silence, the young nurse made a decision, one that would echo through the entire camp before dawn. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She simply turned, picked up her blanket, and stood taller, the fabric draped like armor. That's when the power cut. Total blackout. The officer cursed, stumbling in the dark, while the prisoners stared into the void, waiting for something unthinkable to happen. And it did, because when the generator coughed back to life, the nurse was gone, and her disappearance would ignite a chain of defiance that no uniform could contain. The lights came back sputtering, harsh white cones cutting across the camp's skeleton. Rain had started to mist, settling on rusted drums and boot prints. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the echo traveling through barbed wire fences like a warning. Inside the compound, confusion rippled. The nurse, her name whispered now as Sato, had vanished into the shadows. The American guards fanned out, rifles low. Their boots crunched on coral gravel. The camp, usually loud with orders and machinery, held its breath. You could hear the metallic clang of a mess pot swinging in the wind. Beyond the main yard, rows of low huts squatted like tired beasts, tar paper peeling, ropes flapping. This was where captured Japanese soldiers lived stacked in bunks 2 feet apart, under the relentless Pacific humidity. Reports indicate most camps on these remote islands held between 2,000 and 5,000 prisoners. But here, women were a fraction of a fraction, fewer than 2 in 1,000. They were kept in a segregated corner near the infirmary, for safety, the paperwork said. In reality, it was a pen of silence. Sato had slept there, in Hut 12, beside 2 older nurses and a translator. Now her bunk lay empty, her blanket folded tight. On the dirt wall, a thin scratch line marked the date, a habit prisoners used to keep track of time. The newest mark stopped halfway. Outside, the officer stalked through the rain, jaw clenched. His pride stung. He barked at the guards to search the latrines, the mess, even the old supply shack. One corporal murmured, "Sir, maybe she—" "Don't finish that sentence," came the growl. Inside Hut 12, whispers swirled. Did she escape? Is she hiding? One woman crossed herself. Another whispered a prayer in Japanese. And then someone said softly, "She won't run. She's waiting." The words hung in the damp air, impossible but certain, because Sato was not built for flight. She had spent months tending to men who would have rather died than surrender, and now she was learning what surrender actually meant. At the far end of the camp, behind the infirmary, a dim shape moved, a shadow kneeling beside an overturned barrel. She wasn't escaping. She was cleaning her hands, as if preparing for surgery, and in that quiet, the past began bleeding back. The smell of antiseptic and gunpowder still haunted her hands. Months before the camp, before the humiliation, Sato had stood inside a makeshift field hospital on the island of Leyte. The year was 1944, and the air outside was thick with jungle steam and artillery thunder. Canvas tents flapped like desperate lungs. Inside, rows of wounded soldiers moaned softly under dim lantern light. Sato was 26, a trained nurse from Tokyo University Hospital, drafted under the Imperial Medical Corps. Her job wasn't glory, it was blood. Each day she cleaned wounds with river water, stitched flesh torn by shrapnel, and whispered the same line to each soldier, "Hold on until sunrise." The sunrise rarely came. During the late landings, American shells turned the horizon orange. Sato's commanding officer, a stoic man with silver-rimmed glasses, handed her a final morphine vial and said, "Live with honor." Hours later, their tent exploded. She awoke to silence, half buried under bamboo poles, the smell of iodine and smoke clinging to her hair. When captured, she didn't fight. Reports suggest Japanese field medics suffered casualty rates above 60%. Surrender was almost unthinkable. Yet she did. Her captors were young Americans, barely 20, faces streaked with mud and doubt. One offered her water. Another refused to look at her. In that moment, she realized how small all sides looked up close. Men who'd been told they were gods or monsters, now just breathing the same burned air. On the transport ship to the POW camp, Sato stared at the ocean for days. She counted the gulls, traced clouds, whispered names of the dead like a rosary. Each wave sounded like a heartbeat, each gust like a question. What does honor mean when the empire is ash? At night she dreamt of the hospital, the smell of bandages, the low hum of dying men asking for mothers they'd never see again. Those dreams followed her to the camp. They kept her still when the officer's finger pointed her way. Honor had once been a word. Now it was a muscle, tight, unyielding, alive. When he grabbed her wrist, she didn't flinch. She met his eyes with the calm precision of someone who'd seen worse than death. And the moment his hand touched her skin, the war returned. The tin roof shack buzzed with heat, a single bulb swaying from the ceiling like a tired eye. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving a silence heavy enough to crush breath. Inside, the officer stood by the doorway, boots muddy, shirt unbuttoned, whiskey smell thick in the air. He wasn't a monster by birth, just another man built by power, the kind that grows in isolation and ends in arrogance. Sato stood 2 feet away, her uniform torn at the sleeve, hair damp from rain. Her pulse was steady. Behind her the door had just latched shut. The officer's smirk lingered. "You understand English," he said. She nodded once. "Good. Makes things easier." He expected trembling. He expected pleading. Instead, she met his gaze, flat, calm, unreadable. The same eyes that had watched men bleed out now studied him like a wound that couldn't be saved. Outside, 2 guards pretended to check rifles. They knew what was happening. They also knew to stay silent. The Pacific had its own gravity. It pulled shame downward until it drowned. Reports indicate that roughly 1 in 7 female prisoners worldwide faced sexual coercion during wartime captivity, though official records captured almost none. For most, resistance was suicide, but Sato had learned a paradox only medics understood. Stillness could be stronger than violence. The officer took a step closer, his shadow stretching over her. "You think you're different," he whispered. Her answer came low, in broken English. "No, just human." He froze. For a second, confusion cracked through the alcohol and uniform. Human, the word didn't belong here, not in a place of wire and rank and ration sheets. Something inside him recoiled, like a hand from a flame. Sato didn't blink. Her silence pressed harder than any shout. Every inch of that room became her weapon, the bulb, the mud, the smell of sweat. She'd learned in the field that to survive, you don't fight the wound, you contain it. The officer exhaled sharply, stepped back, muttering something about discipline. But she'd already won. Not through strength, through refusal. Outside, lightning flashed, not thunder, just light. The guards looked up, hearing something inside the shack they'd never forget. Absolute silence. And in that silence, her next words would shatter the night. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. The air inside the shack tasted of rust and sweat. Sato's lips barely moved, but her voice carried like steel. "You can take my body, but you already lost the war." The words hung there, clean, unshaking. Outside, the guards exchanged glances, the night wind scraping dust along the boards. Inside, the officer's face changed from arrogance to something colder, disbelief. He had heard insults before, heard screams and pleas. But this wasn't defiance. It was prophecy. At that very moment, a radio coughed to life in the main office across the yard. A burst of static, then a clipped American voice announcing updates from the Pacific Front. "Saipan has fallen." The officer's knuckles tightened around his belt. Saipan, the word hit like a hammer. It meant the Japanese home islands were now within bomber range. It meant thousands of soldiers, men like Sato's comrades, had died for nothing. Over 9,000, according to official estimates. Sato didn't need to understand the broadcast. She read it in the officer's posture. Shoulders sagging, eyes darkening, the mask of power cracking open. She just stood there, calm, watching the empire on both sides crumble in the same breath. He turned away, muttering something under his breath, maybe a curse, maybe a prayer. For a long second, he looked like a man who'd seen his own reflection for the first time. Then he opened the door and stepped into the rain. When morning came, the camp buzzed with rumors. Some said the captain had been reprimanded. Others said he'd volunteered for reassignment. The official log noted simply, reallocation of duties, disciplinary discretion. But everyone knew why. Sato didn't celebrate. She walked to the infirmary, her steps measured, her gaze lowered. The command assigned her there to keep her busy, though everyone knew it was punishment disguised as mercy. Yet Sato took it quietly, because a nurse's revenge was not destruction. It was endurance. As she scrubbed medical trays that day, she heard the same radio voice again, this time announcing American advances across the Pacific. The war was turning, but her fight was not over. And in the sterile brightness of the infirmary, Her new battle began to heal the very soldiers who had imprisoned her. The infirmary smelled of alcohol, rust, and canned rations. Flies circled the gauze bins. Metal trays clinked softly as Sato washed instruments beneath a dripping pipe. Outside, the tropical sun was merciless, but in here, everything felt dim, like light avoided this place on purpose. She was now Nurse Sato, officially assigned to medical duty under the Geneva Convention's Article 14, a clause that promised humane treatment for all medical POW. On paper, it meant protection. In reality, it was a quiet exile. Her job: tend to wounded American soldiers recovering from jungle skirmishes. Some still looked at her with suspicion. Others refused to meet her eyes. Her first patient was a Marine, barely 20, his leg wrapped in soaked bandages. He stared at her hands, small, precise, unshaking, as she cut the gauze. The silence between them was heavy. Then he muttered, "Didn't think you people could be gentle." She didn't answer. She simply poured antiseptic, stitched the wound, and walked away. Over the next weeks, she treated dozens bullet wounds, malaria fevers, coral cuts. Each face blurred into another. But something strange began to happen. Some soldiers started thanking her. They left their ration biscuits on her tray. One even offered her a cigarette, a small truce in a war that didn't end with surrender. Reports from Red Cross inspections later revealed that many POW camps struggled to follow medical protocols. Yet inside this one, under a tin roof, an uneasy balance had formed. The same officer who once tried to claim her now avoided her completely. Shame, it seemed, was its own punishment. One afternoon, a corporal limped into the infirmary, holding a torn notebook. "You fixed me up good," he said awkwardly. "Guess I owe you." She glanced at the cover, a diary. "Keep it," she said quietly. But that night, curiosity won. When the corporal left it behind, she opened the page he'd marked with a bloodstain. It read, "The Jap nurse shamed the captain without lifting a finger." Sato closed the book, her jaw tightening. She didn't want legend, she wanted silence, but the words had already escaped the pages. By sunrise, the guards were whispering, and by noon, the camp had a new myth, the Quiet Storm. The nickname spread faster than infection. The Quiet Storm, they called her half respect, half fear. It started with that diary entry, a single line scrawled in pencil by a corporal who didn't realize he'd started a wildfire. In the barracks, guards repeated it over coffee tins. By nightfall, even the kitchen staff knew. The camp ran on rumor as much as rations. Without newspapers, gossip became oxygen. Reports from surviving POW camps suggest that nearly 80% of all stories began among guards and spread across command lines within 48 hours. Here it took less than 12. One sergeant told another she made the captain flinch. Another added, didn't even touch him. Each retelling grew sharper, cleaner myth replacing memory. The officer himself, once loud and laughing, now walked the camp with eyes averted. Even his men felt the shift. It was as if the air had chosen sides. Sato didn't speak of it. She continued her duties, cleaning wounds, logging medicine, boiling water at dawn. But everywhere she went, silence followed her, the kind that isn't empty but charged, like the sky before a storm. Inside the infirmary, she noticed small changes. Prisoners began to stand straighter when she passed. A guard once joked, careful, that one could kill you with a stare. The laughter died fast. One evening she found the corporal again, the one who'd written the line. He was sitting outside the barracks, staring at the horizon where the jungle met the sea. "You shouldn't have written it," she said quietly. He smiled. "You did what none of us could. You said no." "I said truth," she replied. "Same thing." He muttered, looking away. But truth had a cost. The captain, the same man who'd once claimed her, soon heard of his new legend. Shame twisted into something darker. The more people whispered, the tighter his jaw clenched. He started drinking heavier, snapping at guards, inventing new duties to reassert control. And one humid night, when rain began drumming on tin again, 3 guards stumbled toward the women's huts, laughing too loud, carrying a flashlight that sliced through the dark like a blade. The quiet storm was about to meet the storm outside. The rain came down like shattered glass, thick, loud, relentless. The camp was half asleep when 3 guards stumbled out from the mess tent, their breath sour with whiskey, their laughter echoing off tin walls. One of them carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through sheets of rain. Their destination was clear, the women's compound. Inside Hut 12, the women sat in darkness, huddled on thin mats. Sato's hands were folded in her lap, her eyes steady. She'd heard the footsteps before anyone else, a nurse's instinct for danger. The first time she'd faced fear, it had been in a hospital tent under fire. This was quieter, but somehow crueler. The guards banged on the door. Inspection. One slurred. Everyone knew it wasn't. The lock rattled. The hinges groaned. Then, as the door swung open, the flashlight beam caught something unexpected. On the small wooden table inside sat a folded Bible, a scalpel glinting beside it, and a note written in careful block letters. The guard closest to the door leaned in to read. The words were simple: "Rules are rules." Reports from Allied archives record over 2,100 incidents of prisoner abuse during the war, with fewer than 50 ever formally investigated. Most ended in silence, buried under bureaucracy, but this one didn't. The lead guard hesitated, his face pale under the weak light. Behind him thunder cracked. Sato stood motionless, her gaze unflinching. For a moment it wasn't fear that filled the room, it was order. The kind born from someone who refused chaos. One of the men whispered, "Let's go." The others followed. No words, no fight, just the heavy sound of retreating boots through puddles. Outside, lightning flashed across the fence, freezing their faces into a photograph of guilt. By morning the story had already spread. The captain didn't show up for inspection. Within a week, paperwork arrived from higher command: transfer, disciplinary grounds, quiet exile. Sato never mentioned the night again. But something shifted in the camp. Discipline returned, tempers cooled, and men started saluting her out of reflex. She never smiled, only nodded once, as if to say the rules had finally remembered themselves. Still, every evening after, she lit one candle. Not for fear, for control. Because power, she'd learned, was sometimes just refusing to kneel. By early 1945, the rhythm of the camp had changed. The beat of boots and orders had softened, replaced by a strange new noise: engines. Every dawn, the low rumble of convoys rolled beyond the wire fences. Trucks, tankers, fuel drums, crates marked spam, shell, and medical. Sato watched them through the infirmary window, each vehicle gleaming with an abundance she couldn't comprehend. She had once believed Japan's war machine was unbreakable, fueled by loyalty and will. But from behind the barbed wire she saw the real engine of victory: production. Reports later confirmed that by 1945, American factories had built over 300,000 aircraft and 86,000 tanks, more than the Axis combined. It wasn't just manpower, it was mathematics. Every crate that rolled past the camp fence seemed to hum a truth she could taste, but never touch. This is why we lost. One day, a supply convoy stopped nearby. American soldiers laughed as they unloaded barrels of fuel, singing songs about home and girls in New York. The smell of gasoline and tinned meat filled the air. Sato stood quietly, her hands clasped, watching them work like an assembly line that never tired. The same officer who once commanded her guards had been replaced by a younger lieutenant, polite, efficient, detached. He saluted her once when she passed carrying bandages. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, and she almost smiled. Almost, the abundance stung more than hunger. For the Japanese prisoners, it was a mirror they couldn't look away from, proof that the war had never been a contest of courage, but of capacity. One guard dropped a box of powdered milk and muttered, "We make more in a day than they see in a year." Sato began to sketch what she saw: fuel drums, convoy lines, human hands passing boxes with rhythm and precision. Her sketches weren't of war, but of momentum. She filled pages quietly, lines steady and exact, as if tracing the machinery of inevitability itself. The jungle outside buzzed with cicadas, the war thundered across oceans. Yet inside that small camp, among ration tins and barbed wire, a nurse began to understand the world's new balance, made not by bullets, but by trucks. And in those sketches she found the shape of mercy. August 1945. The jungle was silent in a way it had never been before. Even the insects seemed to pause. In the camp yard, guards stood with radios pressed to their ears. Then the words came, flat and final, "Japan has surrendered." For a long minute nobody moved, then someone laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that cracked into sobs. Barbed wire that had defined the world suddenly felt irrelevant. The war was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire. Sato was in the infirmary, rolling fresh bandages when she heard it. She froze mid-motion, the cloth slipping from her fingers. The younger lieutenant stepped into the doorway. His voice was careful, almost gentle. "It's done. You're going home, home." The word landed like a stone. Home was Tokyo, burned, broken, gone. Reports from the time estimate that more than 100,000 civilians had died in the Tokyo firebombing alone. For Sato, there was no home left to return to, only ashes and ghosts. Within days, U.S. Command issued repatriation orders for all Japanese civilians and POW. Most accepted without hesitation, but Sato didn't. When her name appeared on the transport list, she crossed it out herself. "I will stay," she said softly. "There are still wounds here." The lieutenant didn't argue. Maybe he understood. Or maybe he was just tired of telling people where they belonged. When the gates finally opened, the camp emptied in waves, barefoot men clutching tin cups, women shielding their eyes from the glare of freedom. Sato stood at the fence, watching them fade into the jungle road. She didn't wave. She simply held her small notebook, its pages filled with sketches of convoys and faces. In one of the final entries, she wrote, "Mercy isn't weakness, it's medicine." She began teaching the remaining guards basic field care, how to clean wounds, how to prevent infection, how to look at a patient without seeing an enemy. Some called her foolish, others called her saint. She didn't care for either. On August 17, 1945, she wrote her last line, "I will teach mercy." And that's exactly what she did until history forgot her name. Decades later, a dusty trunk was opened in a small Ohio attic. Inside lay an old leather-bound journal, its pages brittle, the ink fading to brown. It belonged to a Marine corporal who had served in a Pacific prisoner-of-war camp. His son, now gray-haired himself, flipped through the entries until he found one line underlined twice. The Jap nurse shamed the captain without lifting a finger. The son didn't know her name. No one did. Her file was buried among thousands, marked female medical POW, status, repatriation refused. But her defiance, that silent moment that stopped an entire camp, had survived in whispers, logbooks, and guilt. When declassified U.S. POW testimonies were released in 1988, over 5,000 in total, researchers stumbled across her story again. Not by name, but by tone. A nurse, one report read, who maintained discipline better than most officers. Another called her the Quiet Storm. At the Marine Corps University in Quantico, her case is now studied anonymously in an ethics lecture titled "The Limits of Power." Cadets sit in silence as instructors describe a night when a prisoner of war looked her captor in the eye and said a sentence that ended more than one war, the visible one and the one inside men's minds. Historians still debate what became of her. Some claim she later worked for the Red Cross in the Philippines. Others say she returned to Japan and lived quietly as a teacher. None of it can be proven. Maybe that's fitting. Legends survive because they refuse to be pinned down. The corporal's son donated the journal to a museum in Washington, D.C. It rests behind glass now, open to that single entry. Visitors stop, read, and move on, unaware that the woman it describes once stood unarmed in a shack, facing the full weight of war, and simply refused to bow. If power is the ability to destroy, then restraint is its equal and opposite. Sato's silence didn't just shame a man, it rewired the meaning of victory. And somewhere in the grain of that fading photograph of the camp, she still stands unflinching, unforgotten, unnamed.